July 13th, 2007. Nannup, Australia. 27-year-old Chantal McDougall tells her family that she is planning to travel to Brazil with her 6-year-old daughter Leila, Leila's father Simon Cadwell, and their friend Tony Poppich. The group never returns, and most of their possessions are left behind. It turns out that Simon Cadwell is the leader of a doomsday cult called the Truth Fellowship that has been living under a stolen identity for years. It is theorized that the four of them disappeared to prepare for the impending apocalypse, but there has been no trace of Chantal, Leila, Simon, or Tony for an entire decade. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest minisode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week we are venturing back down under to Australia to cover a bizarre missing persons case involving 4 people. Our podcast has a sizable fan base in Australia, and this particular case was a request from an Australian listener named Shireen, so thank you Shireen. I was already a bit familiar with this story because I featured it in an article I wrote for listverse.com titled 10 Dark Mysteries Involving Strange Cults, which was originally published in March of 2015. This is actually the first mystery I've covered on this podcast involving a cult. It involves a woman named Chantal McDougall, who vanished without explanation alongside her daughter Leila, Leila's father Simon Cadwell, and an acquaintance who was living with them named Tony Poppich. However, alarm bells were raised once it was discovered that Simon was a cult leader living under a stolen identity, and it sounds like Chantal and Tony had fallen completely under his spell. Unlike most missing persons cases featured on this podcast, there is a chance that the victims might still be alive somewhere, but everyone involved just seems to have vanished off the face of the earth. Since we've just passed the 10-year anniversary of these disappearances, I thought this would be an appropriate time to feature their story. I should also provide a brief disclaimer and mention that there seems to be confusion out there about Simon's last name, as half the articles I found refer to him as Cadwell, while the other half call him Cadwill. I watched a segment about this case from the Australian television series Wanted TV, and it sounded to me like they referred to him as Cadwell, so that's what I'm going with here. But feel free to correct me if you know for certain I'm wrong. Anyway, before we get started, just a brief reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes and shorter minisodes like this one. We deliver either a new full-length episode or a new minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music, so if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. The Trail Went Cold also has its own PayPal account and a donate button on our website. If there's anyone out there who wants to make a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we'll be sure to give you a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the unsolved disappearances of 4 members of the cult known as the Truth Fellowship. Our story begins in Western Australia in 2007. Our central figures are 27-year-old Chantal McDougall and her 6-year-old daughter Leila. Leila's father is 45-year-old Simon Cadwell, who has been in a relationship with Chantal since she was a teenager, even though they have never officially married. The two of them originally met when Simon was in a relationship with another woman, and Chantal babysat the couple's son. After Simon and Chantal have a child of their own named Leila, they eventually move into a rented rural farmhouse outside the small Western Australian town of Nannup. The family is joined by a 40-year-old friend named Tony Poppich, who takes up residence in a caravan outside their house. While living there, the couple has elected to homeschool their daughter. Chantal took jobs at a local fish and chip shop and a hotel, while Tony worked at a hardware store. Simon, on the other hand, did not work at all. He gave off the impression of being very controlling of his wife, and often came into town to watch her while she worked. Chantal's parents always found Simon creepy, and he was known for displaying very bizarre and erratic behavior. According to one of his neighbors, Simon went ballistic when he learned that a utilities company was going to install a transformer on a power pole near his property. He started ranting about a conspiracy to divert harmful electromagnetic waves towards his house, and responded by burying magnets around the property in order to divert these waves. He apparently became so flustered by the whole thing that hives started to break out over his face. Anyway, by the summer of 2007, everyone from that house was unemployed and living off payments from Centrelink, which is pretty much the Australian version of Social Security. On July 13th, Chantal phoned her parents in Victoria and told them that the family was planning a trip to Brazil. She claimed that Simon had already left, and that she and Leila were planning to join him. But unfortunately, this would turn out to be the last time Chantal's parents ever spoke to her. By the time October rolled around, they had not heard from Chantal, and officially reported her and Leila missing. Well, it turns out the foursome had pretty much abandoned their home. The landlords arrived one day to find a note on the door in Chantal's handwriting, in which she stated the family was moving to Brazil because the electromagnetic waves in the area were driving Simon crazy. The note also said the landlords could keep any furniture or personal belongings which were still inside the house, but strangely, everyone's wallets and credit cards were left behind, and there were still dirty dishes on the kitchen table. Unfortunately, since 3 months had passed, the owner of the property had already cleaned up and re-rented the house, so it was impossible to perform a forensic examination of the scene. The last confirmed sighting of Chantal took place on July 13th, the same day she phoned her parents. She was last seen selling her vehicle at a car yard in the city of Busselton, which is a 40-minute drive north of Nannup. She received a check of $4,000 for the transaction before leaving in a waiting vehicle. However, even though this $4,000 check was deposited in Chantal's bank account, none of the money in her account has been touched to this day. After not hearing from him for months, Tony Poppage's family officially reported him missing in November. Apparently, Tony's father had sent his son $25,000 for what he claimed was an undisclosed legal matter, but no one knows what became of the money. All anyone knew was that Chantal, Leila, Simon, and Tony had vanished without a trace. Yes, they had left a note indicating they were planning to travel to Brazil, but there was no paper trail to suggest that any of the 4 missing individuals had gone there or even left Australia. It turned out that on July 17th, only 4 days after they were last seen, a Brazilian passenger flight en route from Porto Alegre to Sao Paulo crashed, killing all 187 people on board. Many of the bodies were burned so badly that they could not be positively identified, so there was genuine concern that the 4 of them might have been on the flight. Even though their names weren't on the passenger list, there was good reason to suspect they might be traveling under false names. You see, after delving into Simon Cadwell's background, investigators learned that that wasn't even his true identity. He was originally born in England under a totally different name, and unfortunately, there are conflicting sources out there about what exactly his real name is. Some articles say Gary Felton, some say Gary Feltham, and others say Gary Feldman. Whatever the case, Gary stole the identity of a former associate of his named Simon Cadwell before he moved from England to Australia. And it also turned out that Gary/Simon was the head of a New Age religious cult named the Truth Fellowship. Of course, Chantal was a member of this cult, and her family feared that she had been brainwashed. Simon had also successfully recruited Tony Poppage, who was such a devout follower that he lived with Simon and his family full-time. However, this was mostly an internet-based cult which would meet in an online forum known as the Gateway. Simon managed to recruit between 40 and 50 followers who referred to themselves as the Forecourt. This cult followed the teachings of a doomsday book Simon wrote called Servers of the Divine Plan. After the disappearances, the publisher had the book removed from circulation, though you can still find used copies of it available for sale on Amazon these days. Anyway, this book prophesizes the birth of a new world of higher consciousness after a 75,000-year cycle, and is based around the idea of people becoming the servers mentioned in the title. All of these servers would scatter and travel to different places on Earth in order to prepare for the impending apocalypse. And when the apocalypse finally hit, the servers would all move on to a higher plane of existence. Well, in June of 2007, Simon left his final posting for his followers in the Gateway, and it read, "I'm exhausted, and the only option left is to leave this world." One of these followers eventually revealed that Simon had told her he was considering taking the suicide drug Nembutal alongside his family. When she advised him against it, and told Simon that forcing a child to take a fatal drug like that would be murder, he reconsidered, and said that maybe it would be a better idea for them to just wander off into the wilderness and live in isolation. So given that the Truth Fellowship was a doomsday cult, the absolute worst-case scenario was that Simon had murdered Chantal, Leila, and Tony, or convinced them all to travel to an isolated location to participate in a mass suicide. However, it also seemed possible that the 4 of them could have followed the prophecy of Servers of the Divine Plan and completely disappeared off the grid to await an apocalypse, which obviously hasn't happened. But in 2013, it was announced that an interesting discovery had been made. It turned out that on July 15, 2007, 2 days after the group went missing, Tony Poppage's driver's license was used to rent a double room at a backpackers hostel in the Northbridge suburb of Perth. Earlier that day, someone had also used Tony's cell phone while boarding a train from Bunbury to Perth. The following morning, this same person hopped on a train to Kalgoorlie, and in both cases, they purchased their ticket under the name J. Roberts. Now, given Simon Cadwell's history of stealing identities, no one could be certain if it was Tony himself who used his ID. When this case was profiled on the television show Wanted TV, they even revealed the exact seat J. Roberts would have sat in, and hoped that someone who took that particular train to Kalgoorlie might have remembered seeing him. But it doesn't sound like anyone did, which isn't too surprising since the show aired 6 years after the fact. Anyway, Chantal's parents have worked diligently to keep their missing daughter and granddaughter in the spotlight, but unfortunately, there have been no confirmed sightings of Chantal McDougall, Leila McDougall, Simon Cadwell, or Tony Poppage for an entire decade. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. Well, I think we can all agree that the entire concept of cults is terrifying to most people, and when someone associated with a cult goes missing, the worst thoughts can pop into your head. Perhaps the most famous example of this involves Michelle Miscavige, the wife of the current Church of Scientology leader David Miscavige, and I'm sure I don't have to explain the issues people have with Scientology. Michelle Miscavige just seemed to disappear from the public eye for several years without explanation, and it got to the point where an official missing persons report was filed for her. The police looked into it, and apparently did confirm that Michelle is still alive, but since she continues to keep out of the spotlight, there is still a lot of concern about her well-being. Of course, Simon Cadwell's cult, the Truth of Fellowship, is hardly as powerful as Scientology. It was just a small group that he ran on the internet, and it sounds like only a handful of people took him seriously, but there are still 3 people who are missing because of this guy. And that's not all. In the days following Simon's disappearance, a Canadian follower from the Truth Fellowship committed suicide. Within the next year, an American couple from this group followed suit and did the same thing by taking Nebutol. Now, we cannot be 100% certain that any of these people took their life specifically because of Simon's teachings, but this cult only had between 40 and 50 members. We have 3 suicides combined with 4 unsolved disappearances, and that's still a pretty unsettling number. Now obviously, the idea of Simon, Chantel, Leela, and Tony being murdered or committing a mass suicide is horrifying, but it's almost just as creepy to think of them still being alive somewhere. Imagine the 4 of them living in some remote corner of the Australian outback, cut off from civilization, and preparing for an impending apocalypse which will never happen. It's especially tragic when you consider that Leela was only 6 years old when she vanished. I've seen home video footage of Leela on the Wanted TV segment, and she seems like such a vibrant child. The idea of Leela living her entire childhood in complete isolation, awaiting doomsday, is just heartbreaking to me. Now, it's up for debate whether the Truth Fellowship was just a big scam, and if Simon Cadwell was nothing more than a con man, but he often gave off the impression that he genuinely believed the doomsday scenarios he was preaching. His rants about electromagnetic waves on his property got him so wound up that hives appeared on his face, yet Simon's neighbor claimed he seemed unusually calm and relaxed right before he disappeared. It sounds like Simon's trip to Brazil might have been nothing more than a cover story, but the big question is, did Chantel genuinely believe they were traveling to Brazil, or was she deliberately misleading her family as well? Well, I previously mentioned that investigators looked into the possibility that the 4 missing individuals might have been passengers on the fatal flight which crashed near Porto Alegre on July 17th, but they eventually concluded that it was very unlikely that the group could have made the trip from Australia to Brazil and been on that particular flight in the 4 days since Chantel was last seen. Since there seems to be no paper trail whatsoever for them, it seems very unlikely that Simon, Chantel, Leela, and Tony could have left Australia together. I know that Simon was living under a stolen identity and could have conceivably left the country under another assumed name, but I'm not sure he would have been able to arrange fake identities for 3 other people, especially when one of them was only 6 years old. Leela would have been born shortly before 9/11, so if you ever wanted to take a child out of the country, you'd have to get her a passport, and there's no indication they ever did this. So if the group was still alive, they'd probably still have to be in Australia, and the big issue is that Australia is a very large place and has a lot of remote areas with vast empty space. If they prepared themselves well enough, there are a lot of places where a tiny cult could conceivably live off the grid for a long period of time without anyone ever finding them. The key to this whole mystery might be the usage of Tony Poppage's identification at the hostel in Northbridge 2 days after the group was last seen. If that wasn't actually Tony, and Simon or someone else stole his identity, then there is good reason to fear the worst. The thing with Tony is that it sounds like he had been completely brainwashed by Simon and the Truth Fellowship. He barely made contact with his own family anymore, and was so devoted to Simon that he was willing to follow him to a tiny Australian town in order to live in a caravan behind his house, even though the guy had a family of his own. This does not sound like someone who would be willing to just break away from a cult and go off on his own, and even if he did, why has he made no contact with anyone for an entire decade? There's also the matter of the $25,000 Tony's father apparently sent him before he went missing. I know it's been mentioned that none of the money in Chantel's bank account has ever been touched, but has this $25,000 ever been accounted for? Could this mean that Simon murdered Tony in order to steal his identity and his money? Well, let's look at the geography of this series of events. Whoever used Tony's ID originally took a train from Bunbury, which is nearly 100 kilometers north of Nannup. Perth is nearly 170 kilometers north of Bunbury, but Kalgoorlie is nearly 600 kilometers east of Perth. So whoever got on that train was putting a considerable distance between themselves and Nannup. Now, the last confirmed sighting of Chantel took place 2 days earlier at the car yard in Busselton, which is 60 kilometers northwest of Nannup and about a 40-minute drive away from Bunbury. During her last phone call with her parents, Chantel claimed that Simon had already gone ahead on their so-called trip to Brazil. It doesn't sound like anyone can confirm the exact time that Simon or Tony were last seen, but if Chantel was telling the truth, she and Leela would have been traveling separately from Simon. According to eyewitness accounts, after selling her car in Busselton, Chantel was seen climbing into a waiting vehicle. We have no idea who was driving it, but for all we know, it could have been Simon picking her up. While it doesn't sound like Chantel or Leela were seen at the hostel in Northbridge, it's worth noting that whoever used Tony's ID asked for a double room, so they could have stayed there, and no one remembers seeing them. Of course, it's really concerning to think that Simon could have murdered Chantel, Leela, and Tony, and then gone off on his own. When you consider that Tony's ID was used, and that $25,000 is unaccounted for, that's a distinct possibility. However, let's not forget that after Chantel sold her vehicle for $4,000, she deposited the money into her account, and it's still there to this day. If this whole thing was just a murder-for-profit scheme, then I think Simon would have gotten his hands on that money. By all accounts, he had brainwashed Chantel so much that if he asked her to empty her bank account and give him all her money, she would have done that. The fact that this money hasn't been touched makes me believe this group is either living off the grid somewhere, or they have all committed a mass suicide. But then again, if they had no use for money anymore, why bother selling the car and depositing money in the account to begin with? Is it possible that Chantel did not yet know what Simon had planned for her? Like I said earlier, Simon always gave off the impression that he legitimately believed a lot of the apocalyptic stuff he spouted. If he wanted his family to live in complete isolation to prepare for the end of the world, there are a lot of vast remote areas in Australia where they could disappear to. But on the other hand, if they committed suicide in a remote area, this would also explain why their bodies have never been found. I really have a sick feeling that something like that might have happened, but I can always hope the four of them might still be living somewhere today. Unfortunately, the passage of time makes the second scenario less and less likely. All that being said, if Simon, Chantel, and Tony want to live off the grid and await the apocalypse, then that's their right. They can do this for the rest of their lives if they so choose, just as long as they let their families know they're all right. But what's not acceptable is that they chose this lifestyle for a small child before she was old enough to make this decision for herself. If she's alive, Leela would now be 16 years old, and she's completely missing out on the world because of some doomsday cult leader. This is why these people need to resurface and not force Leela to live this way against her will. So if you have any information about the current whereabouts of Chantel McDougall, Leela McDougall, Tony Poppich, or Simon Cadwell, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own theory, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Before we bring things to a close, I would like to take a moment to play a promo for a podcast which I was interviewed on last month. Podcasts We Listen To.
What got you started podcasting? Would you say that your show is safe for work? How would you describe your show to somebody who hasn't heard it yet? If you were trapped on a desert island with one person, one bottle of booze, and one book or movie, how would you fill those slots? Hi, my name's Jeremy, and I'm the host of the Podcast We Listen To podcast. If you'd like to hear those questions and many others answered by some of your favorite podcast hosts, come subscribe and give my show a shot. Whether it's history, comedy, spooky ghost stories, audio dramas, or true crime podcasts that you're interested in, find out more about your favorite hosts. Or find a new favorite show. Either way, come join me as I interview the hosts of the podcasts we listen to.
Just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. We also have a new donor this week named Sarah, so thank you very much, Sarah. I need to provide a big thank you to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together, and Vince Nitro, who composes our eerie music score. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And we also have a donate button on our website, so if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put in this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. So have yourself a good week, and join me next Wednesday for a brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.